Chapter 1 of T. DeWitt Talmage as I Knew Him. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Larry Wilson. T. DeWitt Talmage as I Knew Him by Thomas DeWitt Talmage. First milestone, 1832 to 1845. Our family Bible, in the record just between the Old and the New Testaments, has this entry: Thomas DeWitt, born January 7th, 1832. I was the youngest of a family of 12 children, all of whom lived to grow up except the first, and she was an invalid child. I was the child of old age. My nativity, I am told, was not heartily welcomed, for the family was already within one of a dozen, and the means of support were not superabundant. I arrived at Middlebrook, New Jersey, while my father kept the toll gate, at which business the older children helped him, but I was too small to be of service. I have no memory of residence there except the day of departure, and that only emphasized by the fact that we left an old cat which had purred her way into my affections, and separation from her was my first sorrow, so far as I can remember. In that home at Middlebrook, and in the few years after, I went through the entire curriculum of infantile ailments. The first of these was scarlet fever, which so nearly consummated its fell work on me that I was given up by the doctors as doomed to die, and according to custom in those times, in such a case, my grave clothes were completed, the neighbors gathering for that purpose. During those early years I took such a large share of epidemics that I have never been sick since, with anything worthy of being called illness. I never knew or heard of anyone who has had such remarkable and unvarying health as I have had, and I mention it with gratitude to God, in whose hand our breath is, and all our ways. The grippe, as it is called, touched me at Vienna when on my way from the Holy Land, but I felt it only half a day, and never again since. I often wonder what has become of our old cradle in which all of us children were rocked. We were a large family, and that old cradle was going a good many years. I remember just how it looked. It was old-fashioned and had no tapestry. Its two sides and canopy were of plain wood, but there was a great deal of sound sleeping in that cradle, and many aches and pains were soothed in it. Most vividly I remember that the rockers, which came out from under the cradle, were on the top and side very smooth, so smooth that they actually glistened. But it went right on and rocked for Phoebe the first, and for DeWitt the last. There were no lords or baronets or princes in our ancestral line. None wore stars, cockade, or crest. There was once a family coat of arms, but we were none of us wise enough to tell its meaning. Do our best, we cannot find anything about our forerunners except that they behaved well, came over from Wales or Holland a good while ago, and died when their time came. Some of them may have had fine equipages and positions, but the most of them were surely only of footmen. My father started in life belonging to the aristocracy of hard knuckles and homespun, but had his high honor that no one could despise. He was the son of a father who loved God and kept his commandments. 2 eyes, 2 hands, and 2 feet were the capital my father started with. Benignity, kindness, keen humor, broad common sense, and industry characterized my mother. The Reverend Dr. Chambers was for many years her pastor. He had 50 years of pastorate service in Somerville, New Jersey, and the Collegiate Church, New York. He said in an address at the dedication of the Brooklyn Tabernacle that my mother was the most consecrated Christian person he had ever known. My mother worked very hard, and when we would come in and sit down at the table at noon, I remember how she used to look. There were beads of perspiration along the line of her gray hair, and sometimes she would sit down at the table and put her head against her wrinkled hand and say, "Well, the fact is, I'm too tired to eat." My father was a religious, hard-working, honest man. Every day began and closed with family worship, led by my father, or, in case of his absence, by mother. That which was evidently uppermost in the minds of my parents, and that which was the most pervading principle in their lives, was the Christian religion. The family Bible had a perfect fascination for me, not a page that was not discolored either with time or tears. My parents read out of it as long as I can remember. When my brother Van Ness died in a foreign land, and the news came to our country home, that night they read the eternal consolations out of the old book. When my brother David died, that book comforted the old people in their trouble. My father, in midlife, 15 years an invalid, out of that book read of the ravens that fed Elijah, all through the hard struggle for bread. When my mother died, that book illumined the dark valley. In the years that followed of loneliness, it comforted my father with the thought of reunion, which took place afterward in heaven. To the wonderful conversion of my grandfather and grandmother, in those grand old days of our Declaration of Independence, I trace the whole purpose, trend, and energies of my life. I have told the story of the conversion of my grandfather and grandmother before. I repeat it here for my children. My grandfather and grandmother went from Somerville to Baskinridge to attend revival meetings under the ministry of Dr. Finney. They were so impressed with the meetings that when they came back to Somerville, they were seized upon by a great desire for the salvation of their children. That evening the children were going off for a gay party, and my grandmother said to the children, "When you get all ready for the entertainment, come into my room. I have something very important to tell you." After they were all ready, they came into my grandmother's room, and she said to them, "Go and have a good time. But when you are gone, I want you to know I am praying for you, and will do nothing but pray for you until you get back." They did not enjoy the entertainment much, because they thought all the time of the fact that Mother was praying for them. The evening passed. The next day my grandparents heard sobbing and crying in the daughter's room, and they went in and found her praying for the salvation of God. And her daughter Phoebe said, "I wish you would go to the barn and to the wagon house, for Jehiel and David, the brothers, are under powerful conviction of sin." My grandparents went to the barn, and Jehiel, who afterward became a useful minister of the gospel, was imploring the mercy of Christ, and then, having first knelt with him and commended his soul to Christ, they went to the wagon house, and there was David crying for salvation of his soul. David, who afterward became my father. David could not keep the story to himself, and he crossed the fields to a farmhouse and told one to whom he had been affianced the story of his own salvation, and she yielded her heart to God. The story of the converted household went all through the neighborhood. In a few weeks 200 souls stood up in the plain meeting house at Somerville to profess faith in Christ, among them David and Catherine, afterwards my parents. My mother, impressed with that, in after life, when she had a large family of children gathered around her, made a covenant with 3 neighbors, 3 mothers. They would meet once a week to pray for the salvation of their children, until all their children were converted. This incident was not known until after my mother's death, the covenant then being revealed by one of the survivors. We used to say, "Mother, where are you going?" And she would say, "I am just going out a little while, going over to the neighbors." They kept on in that covenant until all their families were brought into the kingdom of God, myself the last, and I trace that line of results back to that evening when my grandmother commended our family to Christ, the tide of influence going on until this hour, and it will never cease. My mother died in her 76th year. Through a long life of vicissitude she lived harmlessly and usefully, and came to her end in peace. We had often heard her, when leading family prayers in the absence of my father, say, "O Lord, I ask not for my children wealth or honor, but I do ask that they all may be the subjects of thy converting grace." Her 11 children brought into the kingdom of God, she had but one more wish, and that was that she might see her long-absent missionary son, and when the ship from China anchored in New York harbor, and the long-absent one passed over the threshold of his paternal home, she said, "Lord, now lettest thou thy servant depart in peace, for mine eyes have seen thy salvation." The prayer was soon answered. My father, as long as I can remember, was an elder in churches. He conducted prayer meetings in the country, when he was sometimes the only man to take part, giving out a hymn and leading the singing, then reading the Scriptures and offering prayer, then giving out another hymn and leading in that, and then praying again, and so continuing the meeting for the usual length of time, and with no lack of interest. When the church choir would break down, everybody looked around to see if he were not ready with Woodstock, Mount Pisgah, or Uxbridge. And when all his familiar tunes failed to express the joy of his soul, he would take up his own pen, draw 5 long lines across the sheet, put in the notes, and then to the tune he called Bound Brook begin to sing: "As when the weary traveller gains the height of some o'erlooking hill, his heart revives if cross the plains his eye his home, though distant still. Thus when the Christian pilgrim views by faith his mansion in the skies, the sight his fainting strength renews, and wings his speed to reach the prize. 'Tis there," he says, "I am to dwell with Jesus in the realm of day. There I shall bid my cares farewell, and he will wipe my tears away." He knew about all the cheerful tunes that were ever printed in the old New Brunswick collection and the Shenway, and the sweetest melodies that Thomas Hastings ever composed. He took the pitch of sacred song on Sabbath morning, and kept it through all the week. My father was the only person whom I ever knew without any element of fear. I do not believe he understood the sensation. Seated in a wagon one day during a runaway that every moment threatened our demolition, he was perfectly calm. He turned around to me, a boy of 7 years, and said, "DeWitt, what are you crying about? I guess we can ride as fast as they can run." There was one scene, I remember, that showed his poise and courage as nothing else could. He was sheriff of Somerset County, New Jersey, and we lived in the courthouse, attached to which was the county jail. During my father's absence one day, a prisoner got playing the maniac, dashing things to pieces, vociferating horribly, and flourishing a knife with which he had threatened to carve any one who came near the wicket of his prison. Constables were called in to quell this real or dramatized maniac, but they fell back in terror from the door of the prison. Their show of firearms made no impression upon the demented wretch. After a while my father returned and was told of the trouble, and indeed he heard it before he reached home. The whole family implored him not to go near the man who was cursing and armed with a knife. But father could not be deterred. He did not stand outside the door and at a safe distance, but took the key and opened the door, and without any weapon or defense came upon the man, thundering at him, "Sit down and give me that knife." The tragedy was ended. I never remember to have heard him make a gloomy remark. This was not because he had no perception of the pollutions of society. I once said to my father, "Are people so much worse now than they used to be?" He made no answer for a minute, for the old people do not like to confess much to the boys. But after a while his eye twinkled, and he said, "Well, DeWitt, The fact is that people were never any better than they ought to be. Ours was an industrious home. I was brought up to regard laziness as an abominable disease. Though we were some years of age before we heard the trill of a piano, we knew well all about the song, "The Spinning Wheel." Through how many thrilling scenes my father had passed! He stood at Morristown in the choir that chanted when George Washington was buried, talked with young men whose fathers he had held on his knee, watched the progress of John Adams' administration, denounced at the time Aaron Burr's infamy, heard the guns that celebrated the New Orleans victory, voted against Jackson, but lived long enough to wish he had another just like him, remembered when the first steamer struck the North River with its wheel buckets, was startled by the birth of telegraphy, saw the United States grow from a speck on the world's map till all nations dipped their flag at our passing merchantmen. He was born while the Revolutionary cannon were coming home from Yorktown, and lived to hear the tramp of troops returning from the war of the Great Rebellion. He lived to speak of the names of 80 children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren. He died just 3 years from the day when my mother sped on. When my father lay dying, the old country minister said to him, "Mr. Talmage, how do you feel now as you are about to pass the Jordan of death?" He replied, and it was the last thing he ever said, "I feel well. I feel very well. All is well." Lifting his hand in a benediction, a speechless benediction, which I pray God may go down through all the generations, "It is well." 4 of his sons became ministers of the gospel. Reverend James R. Talmage, D.D., who was preaching before I was born, and who died in 1879. Reverend John Van Ness Talmage, D.D., who spent his life as a missionary in China, and died in the summer of 1892. Reverend Goyne Talmage, D.D., who after doing a great work for God died in 1891. But all my brothers and sisters were decidedly Christian, lived usefully, and died peacefully. I rejoice to remember that though my father lived in a plain house the most of his days, he died in a mansion provided by the filial piety of his son who had achieved a fortune. The house at Gateville, near Boundbrook, in which I was born, has gone down. Not one stone has been left upon another. I one day picked up a fragment of the chimney, or wall, and carried it home. But the home that I associate with my childhood was about 3 miles from Somerville, New Jersey. The house, the wagon shed, the barn are now just as I remember them from childhood days. It was called Uncle John's place, from the fact that my mother's uncle John Van Ness owned it, and from him my father rented it on shares. Here I rode the horse to brook. Here I hunted for and captured Easter eggs. Here the natural world made its deepest impression on me. Here I learned some of the fatigues and hardships of the farmer's life, not as I felt them, but as my father and mother endured them. Here my brother Daniel brought home his bride. From here I went to the country school. Here in the evening the family was gathered, mother knitting or sewing, father vehemently talking politics or religion with some neighbor not right on the subject of the tariff or baptism, and the rest of us reading or listening. All the group are gone except my sister Catherine and myself. My childhood, as I look back upon it, is to me a mystery. While I always possessed a keen sense of the ludicrous and a hearty appreciation of fun of all sorts, there was a sedate side of my nature that demonstrated itself to the older members of the family, and of which they often spoke. For half-days or whole days at a time, I remember sitting on a small footstool beside an ordinary chair on which lay open Scott's Commandments on the Bible. I not only read the Scriptures out of this book, but long discourses of Thomas Scott and passages adjoining. I could not have understood much of these profound and elaborate commentaries. They were not written or printed for children, but they had for my childish mind a fascination that kept me from play, and from the ordinary occupations of persons of my years. So also was the religious literature of the old-fashioned kind, with which some of the tables of my father's house were piled. Indeed, when afterwards I was living at my brother's house, he a clergyman, I read through and through the 4 or 5 volumes of Dwight's Theology, which must have been a wading in far beyond my depth. I think if I had not possessed an unusual resiliency of temperament, the reading and thinking so much of things pertaining to the soul and a future state would have made me morbid and unnatural. And this tendency to read and think in sacred directions was not a case of early piety. I do not know what it was. I suppose in all natures there are things inexplicable. How strange is the phenomenon of childhood days to an old man! How well I remember Sanderson's stagecoach running from New Brunswick to Easton, as he drove through Somerville, New Jersey, turning up to the post office and dropping the mail bags with 10 letters and 2 or 3 newspapers. On the box Sanderson himself, 6 feet 2 inches and well proportioned, long lash whip in one hand, the reins of 6 horses in the other, the leaders lathered along the lines of the traces, foam dripping from the bits. It was the event of the day when the stage came. It was our highest ambition to become a stage driver. Some of the boys climbed on the great leathern boot of the stage, and those of us who could not get on shouted, "Cut behind!" I saw the old stage driver not long ago, and I expressed to him my surprise that one around whose head I had seen a halo of glory in my boyhood time was only a man like the rest of us. Between Sanderson's stagecoach and a Chicago express train, what a difference! And I shall always marvel at our family doctor, dear old Skillman. My father's doctor, my mother's doctor in the village home. He carried all the confidences of all the families for 10 miles around. We all felt better as soon as we saw him enter the house. His face pronounced a beatitude before he said a word. He welcomed all of us children into life, and he closed the old people's eyes. End of chapter 1.